Hi, so my name is Jennifer Frazee, and I'm one of the historical interpreters here at Hunter's Home. This month is March, and so we're going to be discussing women's history. And basically, what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit deeper look at some of the women who formed the history of this place. And of course, we're going to start with Minerva since she's the reason why we're all here right now. So, Minerva was born in 1819, and she was the daughter of Lewis Ross, who was the treasurer of Cherokee Nation, and his wife, Fanny Holt Ross. And so, they're living back east, they're doing fine. And Lewis is involved in some general store type situation. He's involved in some sort of trade. And then Minerva's future husband, George, shows up on the scene. Now, George Merle was a white man, and he was from Virginia, and his family were, in the planter field, and the planter kind of people, and they had a plantation, and they also had stores and things like that they kind of had dealings in as well. And so one of their sons, Onslow Glenmore, came up to Tennessee in the vicinity of Lewis and Minerva, and so George came up to Tennessee as well so that he could learn, I guess, some of the trade from his brother, and so they kind of get into business together. And we're thinking that's probably how George and Lewis met, and in that case, that's also how George and Minerva ended up meeting. So Minerva's going to school. Young ladies at the time, we're getting into our cult of womanhood at this point in time, where women are kind of the ones who are in charge of making sure that their kids and their families maintain high spirituality. They're being decent, good, God-fearing people, that sort of thing. But they also have to put on certain airs, and they have to make a certain impression on people that's considered appropriate at the time. And so ladies had to learn to do that. They also, as we're going to come to see as we get a little bit deeper into this video, had to learn how to manage a household, which was a lot more difficult back then than it is today. So what happens is somehow George and Minerva meet. They have enough time to talk to each other enough to, fall into love or lust or whatever you want to call it. And according to Minerva's cousin, Shorey Ross, they asked Lewis and Fanny if they could be married. And for whatever reason, they were denied that request. It could be because he was white and she was Cherokee, but, and they could kind of see, of course, we know racism was going on at that time. I think it was Elias Boudinot's wife. They burned her in effigy for marrying a Cherokee man. So they're going to see these kind of things going on. Fanny was a white woman and she married Lewis Ross, and so her family could have reacted in a certain way that made her, want to make sure her children were taken care of, or Lewis wanted his children taken care of. And so that could have been it. It could have been that Minerva was 15 and George was in his mid-20s at this time, although age really wasn't a huge consideration at this point in time at all. But for whatever reason, they said no, and George and Minerva said, okay, and they decided to elope. And so according to Shorey Ross and family legend, George got a boat and took it up the Hiawassee River, which backs onto Lewis Ross's plantation back in Tennessee. And so he came up that river and docked there, and Minerva was keeping an eye out for him. And as soon as she saw him coming up the river, she took off running out the back door. She actually, they said that she tripped and fell and lost her shoe, shades of Cinderella. And so George hopped out of the boat and went and picked her up and carried her back to it. And then they went to the Cherokee agency where they were married, and then presented her parents with a done deal. Not a whole lot you can do past that point. And so they were married. They settled there in Tennessee, and on a census, they're said to be living on a little plot of land, and they own, 4 people, and he's calling himself a farmer by this point. So we're not 100% sure how their relationship was in terms of what we know through studies of planter class and the women, the mistresses of plantations and things like that. That's firmly under a patriarchal view. And so we're not 100% sure how the women who were Cherokee reacted in that type of situation. We do know that, like Dr. Miles, who wrote The House on Diamond Hill, we get a little bit of insight from books like that. But for this, we really don't have a whole lot of records that show us how Minerva interacted in this sphere. So did they operate under patriarchal roles? We don't know. Did they operate mainly under matriarchal roles? Since that's what the Cherokee Nation, Cherokees were matriarchal, by this point had they've been colonized enough to start moving towards that. We're really not sure. So we're going to base it off as much as we can about people who, I've got notes and letters and things like that we're going to go over. So we're just going to kind of base our understanding off of that. So we do know that she did go to school to learn to be to be able to run a house and everything. All right, so we know that the Treaty of New Echota was signed, and that caused a rift between members of the Cherokee Nation. And so what happens is that treaty was signed, and, of course, Chief Ross went to the court systems with it to fight it so they could stay back east, and Andrew Jackson, kind of overlooked it and flouted the law there a little bit, and, forced them out here to Indian Territory. And so we kind of have an idea of the environment Minerva came into whenever she got here. And so I'm going to read a little letter here that kind of illustrates some of the situations that's going on at the time. And it's from February 9th, 1841, and it's from Lewis Ross to his son John. He says, "Dear John, there has been some excitement gotten up against us. A conspiracy was formed by S. Wadey, John Fields, and others to take the lives of John Ross, Jesse Bushyhead, Robert Brown, Sheriff, and myself, which was to have been done on the 12th January. But the conspiracy was made known to us by Jack Bell and Washington Adair, who no doubt felt their own safety would be jeopardized by such an act, and therefore the information was given us, not from any love they had for us. We received the information on the 12th by express, and by night had sufficient number of friends about us to defend us from acts of violence." So, so what happens is whenever they came here, whenever the nations came here, there was a little bit of a civil war that broke out amongst them, and that caused some pretty bad issues between them. There was a lot of violence going on through here. It was very wild out here for a period of time, and so that's the environment that Minerva and her family are going to be coming out here in. At this point in time, also, they're fighting amongst one another and they're harming each other's homes. Chief Ross's daughter, her house was attacked by some of them. It's giving criminal elements that are living here an excuse to be able to, go steal from people and things like that, because then they're going to think, oh, it's that treaty party that did it, or oh, it's the Ross party that did it, that kind of situation. And so she's coming here into a very volatile atmosphere at the time. Eventually, though, it kind of settled down, and later on in that letter, Lewis says that he can't leave until Merle gets here, and so that kind of lets us know that, and other letters that we see, that there are no hard feelings about the elopement, so the families are still really getting along. And as we see through letters, diaries, and things like that, the family is constantly visiting one another back and forth. So as we understand, she's living in a situation, Minerva is, where she has to maintain certain impression on people. Like I talked about the cult of womanhood, but really, it boils down to her, what she is a reflection upon not only her family, but also her husband. And that was very important at this point in time. And so she's going to be in charge of the domestic sphere out here, and it's going to be her job to make sure that everything is running smoothly. If she and George were to have children, she would be in charge of making sure that they grew up upright, devout, religious, upstanding citizens of both this nation and, George's nation, the United States. And so, that's kind of the thing that she's going to have to be doing out here. And she's going to have to make sure everything is running smoothly. And that's where her education comes in handy. Now, that's a thing that was expected of women. But looking over some of the information, the diary, that Emily wrote whenever she got here. So Emily is George's niece, and she came out here and stayed in the summer of 1850 and kept a diary while she was here. And on her first night here, she gets here and there's nobody here, So Minerva had gone to go help get a wedding set up. So those are the kind of things that are going on at that time. She's prepping weddings. She's helping people with birthday parties. She is, out at somebody's house helping them with a quilting bee or a sewing bee. She's helping, get birthdays planned and, things like that. So she is constantly on the move. She's also, setting up, she really loved children from what we understand, but she wasn't able to have any. I think because of looking at the treatments that she was given, she was unable to carry a child to term. And so that was probably a soft point for her. And so, we have understandings where she brought the neighborhood children over she told them Bible stories because she was a very devout Christian. We have writings that tell us that she was at tent revivals and things, and she was shouting and clapping and singing along with the loudest of them. And she also, had the neighborhood children come out, and she'd give them treats, and she'd tell them stories and Bible stories and things like that. And then, of course, she raised her cousins. So whenever one of her cousins passed away, she raised two of his children, and that would be Joshua Ross and his sister Jenny Pocahontas Ross. And so she helped raise them, and she had a lot of Bible studies out here. They had prayer circles out here and things like that. She was constantly moving, constantly on the go, and that's really important at this time because, like I said, it is the cult of womanhood at the time, but that gives an image that people have to uphold. And so they had a lot of famous people coming out here to stay, and so that was kind of she really had to stay on top of her game. So her energy levels were really great for that. We have people who talked about how there were weddings here at the house. William Shorey Cootie was married out here. There were a couple of other people who were Wooster's daughter, I do believe. She was married out here as well, and they got married down in the parlor, possibly. Thomas Heineman, who was a brigadier general for the Confederate Army, he came out here and stayed for a little bit. Albert Pike came out here and stayed. There were some famous reverends that came out here, painters, artists, things like that. They're coming out here. Statesmen and people like that are coming out here to stay, and so it's Minerva's job to make sure they're entertained sufficiently, and it's her job to make sure that the house is clean and that the food is delicious and all this other stuff to make sure that people aren't going to be disappointed whenever they get out here. And so that's where her training and things come in handy, and that's also where it kind of comes in handy a little bit that she is able to be in charge of such a large force of enslaved people out here too. So she is going to use them to her advantage out here as well in that entertainment. So whenever I say she had to make sure that there were delicious delicacies, for all these famous people that were coming out to be entertained, she was in charge of making sure that Eliza got that done, the cook of the plantation. Whenever we're talking about, she's in charge of making sure the house is clean and all that stuff. She's in charge of making sure that Sylvia gets the house clean, that kind of thing. So they also had parties until 2 o'clock in the morning out here. They would entertain the guys from the fort, the soldiers from the fort, to come out here, and then the ladies from the female seminary to come out here. And so they had little parties where they could mix and kind of under a chaperoned and safe environment meet and form couples and things. And so a couple of the people from those parties ended up getting married later on, that sort of thing. So her image, the house, and the enslaved people who were living here, they reflected upon George. And so, and if not amongst her family and the circles that her family were in, like I said earlier, it's going to be amongst his circle of family that he moves in. All right, so what were her roles in the plantation? Okay, so she manages while George is away. So generally, whenever the man of the plantation, the owner of the plantation, whenever he is gone, and of course she's the owner here because she's a Cherokee woman, so whenever he is gone, it's her job to manage everything. So she's got to keep the books. She also has to make sure that she's supervising the crops, making sure they're getting put in the way they're supposed to. She's supervising the overseer to make sure he's handling things the way he's supposed to. Generally, the women also supervised the enslaved people and made sure that everything was going well with them and that they were kind of on task. So she's keeping a logbook. A lot of information that we find about the women of this time period is because they keep these diaries, which are, some people think are full of flowery poetry and things like that. Absolutely not. It's full of all the day-to-day rigors that go on in their life, the things that they have to take care of, the enslaved people that are sick, the medicines that they made for them and gave them, if it was bad enough that they had to call a doctor in, that sort of thing. How much crop of something had to be put in, and how they had to fight with the overseer, or if they were fortunate enough, they were able to tell the overseer, hey, I need this, and he made sure that it happened, things like that. They also had to determine, she had to sit down with Eliza and plan out the meals, and so she had to make sure that all the meals were ready. So meal planning on a huge scale at this point in time. And so, of course, meal planning determined the need for planting. And so she is, getting these meals ready, determining the menus for the week or whatever. She has to keep track of the things that are in the larder, the stuff that they have put by, that they've been growing, any of their supplies and things. If something's getting low, she's got to make sure that it's replenished. And she has to make sure that she is working with George and the overseer to make sure that they're not going to go without in the winter. And so that's one of the things that she has to keep track of. So she's keeping the books and the logs for things like that. She also has to make sure that she keeps track of the household duties. So she has to speak with her head housekeeper, who would be the enslaved woman, probably, I'm going to say Sylvia right now, because she's the oldest that we know of that was working within the house. And so that's the person I'm going to speak of. But keep in mind, whenever I say these names, that there were 42 enslaved people here on the property that George and Minerva owned. And so I'm not 100% who would have been that person that was in charge of making sure those things happened. So she would have to sit down with her enslaved people and tell them, we're going to have this party. It's going to go on until this time, and these people are probably going to stay. So you need to make sure this room is opened up for the men and this room is opened up for the women. And we need to have, so much linens ready and things like that, so that her guests, whenever they came here, wanted for nothing, because again, that's a reflection on the people. And so since she is already high up, being a part of Cherokee Nation official families, like the chief and the treasurer, she already reflects upon them. But then she also has to work within this circle of reflecting upon her husband and the view that a man was only as good as his surroundings and the people that were around him. So if his wife is very well kept and his wife serves delicious meals and his enslaved people are well dressed and taken care of and his home is very well dressed and taken care of, then he is obviously a wonderful person. And so there's a lot of expectation on women at this point in time. And of course, she's going to be in the middle of that too. Now, not only does she have obligations to her household, where she's taking care of all of those things, but she also has obligations to the enslaved people that she is in charge of. So she has to make sure that they're fed. So she's talking about their rations and things like that. And then, of course, in some places, the enslaved people are expected to get their own food. They're given some rations, and then they have to go out and do their own thing. And in other places, we're understanding that the cook cooked for everybody, at least for the lunch. And so she has to make sure that's taken care of. But she's also in charge of making sure they're clothed. Like I said, a lot of people understand that the enslaved people were a reflection upon their owners, and there were some laws in place that you couldn't, and if there weren't laws, then they would shun people who mistreated their enslaved people up to a point. But in any case, from the WPA slave narratives, we're understanding that these the enslaved people would say that this owner would treat them well and give them nice clothes. This owner only let them wear, long-tailed shirts and things like that. And so whichever way they landed here, which of course we don't have any kind of evidence on that, she had to make sure that they were clothed. So she's going to be working with Susan. And our last video that we put up not too long ago about the enslaved people, you're going to see that information, so I won't go into detail on it here. But so she's going to have to work with Susan to make sure that, it's time for us to get all the enslaved clothing for the year, for the summer or for the winter or whatever. And so she would have to order all the cloth, and then she and Susan would cut it out. And then of course she has to oversee and make sure Susan's sewing the clothes up the way it's supposed to be and that sort of thing. So she's in charge of that. She's also in charge of their medical care. So she has to make sure that if an enslaved person is sick, they come to her and she gives them medicine. Depending upon, what they have here and her outlook on how her responsibilities should land, that depended upon the kind of care they got. But, that's one of the things that she's in charge of taking care of. All right. So generally the enslaved people are under the care of the woman, from what I'm finding out. So the mistress of the plantation is going to be the one that's responsible for taking care of the enslaved people, which, depending upon the personality of that mistress, that kind of could put the enslaved people in an even more tenuous space, or it could make it a little bit easier on them. We're not, sure how that was going to be for here. All right, so her obligations to George, she's supposed to be his helpmeet. She's supposed to be his advisor, his confidant. He's supposed to be able to talk to her about his hopes and dreams and that sort of thing. generally speaking in this type of situation. But with regards to George and Minerva, we have a slight insight into their lives because we have that diary from Emily, and she's able to kind of discuss how they are whenever other people aren't around. And it's my opinion that they really did care about each other quite a lot. I feel like George probably held her in high affection, and mainly because, whenever she was sick, he would do things, he would like dance around the room and to try to make her laugh and cheer her up whenever she felt ill. And so he was quite solicitous of her, and so I do believe that they really care about one another. It was likely a love match. He didn't, pull the wool over her eyes or anything, from what I understand. And so that brings us to her death. Now, she passed away in January of 1855, and she was 36 years old. And so, from what we understand, she had malaria. Her doctor called it bilious fever. She had a doctor named Dr. Brown, and we have some of his notes from his treatments of her. And so he's giving her, quinine. He's giving her mercury-based medicines such as calomel or blue mass, as some of you will see it called. And so he's giving her these medicines to kind of treat her. At the time, the recommended treatment for people with malaria or bilious fever was that you bleed them until the symptoms abated, and then you give them quinine, which is it just blows my mind, because if you just give them the quinine, they'd feel better, right? So he's giving her, calomel, which is powdered mercury, and he's giving her bitters, which is a tonic that contains quinine, but it also has strychnine in it to induce vomiting, that kind of thing, because at this point in time, they are still under the belief of antiphlogistic medicine. So they're still believing that people have, humors, and that bad air and miasma is what causes illness. They're not quite understanding what germs are at this point in time. Had no idea that the mosquitoes are the ones that are giving these people these illnesses, and it's actually a parasite that, that's the problem. And so, so they're giving her all these treatments, and we know that because Emily keeps that diary, and she talks about some of the things that Dr. Brown does for Minerva, and then, of course, we have his doctor's notes that talk about some of the treatments that he gives her. And he not only diagnoses her with bilious fever, but he also says that she is suffering from a derangement of the uterus. Possibly because she, I'm not 100% sure. I'm assuming that it's a thing that they kind of said, well, we're not really sure what's wrong with women, so it's got to be, her uterus is having some issues, maybe because she couldn't have kids. I'm not 100% sure. But he also says that she is, this is possibly a depression that she's dealing with because of her bed rest. So apparently, according to him and the letters that we have and the, inserts from the diaries that Emily talked about, she was extremely active. I mean, it's like she is the only thing that can keep her from going, like the Energizer Bunny, is getting sick. And so he even points out that he thinks that she's probably suffering from a little bit of depression because she chafes at the inaction. She can't get up and do things. She's just kind of stuck here on this bed, and it's really bothering her. And so whenever she's sick, you see all of her family members coming in. So her mom comes and visits and kind of takes care of the thing for a little bit. Her sister comes out and kind of takes care of things while she's not feeling well, Amanda. Of course, Emily's here, and she has the enslaved people that take care of her and all that stuff. And eventually, so she has these bouts of illness that she suffers from and things. Eventually she starts to get really worse. Her illness kind of takes hold of her. The treatments that she's getting doesn't help at all. They don't help at all. And then, according to Shori, she actually talked to George and possibly Amanda as well, her sister Amanda, and she asked them to marry each other whenever she passed away. And that's another really common thing that's going on at the time, because that kind of keeps the property in the family. If there's any children from the first marriage, they're assuming the best mother for those children after their mother passes away is going to be their aunt. You've got the same culture, the same ideology, that sort of thing. So that's pretty common. But it's also, Amanda is getting up there in age, and she's not been married yet. And so the family's probably really worried about her not getting married. And then, of course, Minerva wants George to be taken care of, because I really do believe they really cared highly for one another. And so she gets their agreement with that plan, I guess. And then, in January of 1855, she passed away at 36 years of age. And so that is how we come to be where we're at is because of Minerva. And then it continues on because she ensured its continuance in a way. Because what happened is by making sure that her sister married George, she enabled George to be able to continue on out here. Because of course, you couldn't live out here if you didn't have some kind of connection and you weren't Cherokee. And so by him marrying Amanda, he was able to continue that connection on. Now, they got married, Amanda and George, 2 years after Minerva's death. And I'm not 100% sure why that 2 years happened, although I did find in our research over mourning customs and things of the time, that's about the length of time for somebody to mourn a loved one who's lost, not on his end, a month to 3 months, I think, after Minerva passed away, George could go on and do whatever he wanted. But women, such as Amanda, had to stay in the mourning quite a bit longer, where it was considered unseemly. All right, so that is our information on Minerva. The next one that we're going to talk about, we're going to get into a little bit more, is going to be the Civil War and what's going on here during that time. And so the person that we're going to talk about then is going to be Eliza Jane Ross and her experiences here at Hunter's Home during the Civil War. So look for that one to come up here in the next week. And thank you guys for watching. Thank y'all.